Ask most people outside Italy to describe Italian ancestry, and you'll get one answer, as if the entire country shares a single uniform genetic identity. In 2019, the largest genome-wide study of Italian population genetics ever conducted found something that directly contradicts that assumption. Italy, a country you could drive across in a single day, turned out to contain more internal genetic structure than any other region studied anywhere in Europe. And the line running straight through the middle of it falls almost exactly where you'd expect between north and south. This is the real genetic story behind northern and southern Italian ancestry, and why the differences run far deeper than accent or cuisine. For most people, both inside and outside Italy, the assumption is simple. Italians are Italians, a single ethnic and genetic identity stretching from the Alps down to Sicily, with regional differences amounting to little more than dialect, food, and local pride. It's an understandable assumption. Italy has existed as a unified nation only since 1861, and national identity, once established, tends to smooth over the deeper history sitting underneath it. Here's the first real crack in that assumption. In 2019, a large international research team led by geneticist Alessandro Raveane analyzed genome-wide genetic data from Italian populations across the entire peninsula, drawing on more than 1,000 modern Italian samples with wide geographical coverage, and comparing it against both modern and ancient DNA samples from across Europe and the wider Mediterranean world, publishing the results in the journal Science Advances. The finding that made headlines within population genetics circles was striking. Differences in ancestry composition between Italian regions had generated the largest degree of population genetic structure detected anywhere in Europe up to that point, more internal genetic variation packed into one country than researchers had found across entire other regions of the continent, a result that surprised even researchers who had expected some regional variation going in. Here's the deeper layer explaining where that structure actually comes from. The study found that southern Italian populations carry a distinct genetic signature connected to ancient ancestry from the Caucasus region, arriving through a separate historical route than the one that shaped most of the rest of Europe. Northern European populations largely absorbed their Caucasus-related genetic signal indirectly, carried westward by Bronze Age steppe herders migrating out of the Pontic-Caspian region thousands of years ago, the same migration wave that reshaped genetic ancestry across much of the continent. Southern Italy, by contrast, shows evidence of an additional, more direct pulse of Caucasus-related ancestry, arriving later through Mediterranean and Near Eastern contact, rather than the northern steppe migration route. Layered on top of the older, shared European ancestry already present, essentially a second, separate wave that never reached most of the rest of the continent in the same concentrated way. That genetic pattern lines up closely with documented history most people already know and outline, even if they've never connected it to DNA before. Starting around the 8th century BCE, Greek colonists founded a network of cities across Sicily and the southern Italian mainland, so extensive that the region became known in antiquity as Magna Graecia, Great Greece, with some of these colonial cities, like Syracuse and Taranto, eventually growing larger and wealthier than cities back in mainland Greece itself, complete with their own philosophers, temples, and political institutions. Phoenician and later Carthaginian traders established their own settlements along Sicily's coasts around the same period, drawn by the island's strategic position at the center of Mediterranean trade routes. Centuries later, the Byzantine Empire held onto Sicily and parts of southern Italy long after Rome's Western Empire collapsed, followed by direct Arab conquest and rule over Sicily beginning in the 9th century, a period that introduced new agricultural techniques, architecture, and, inevitably, new genetic ancestry into the local population. And Norman conquest, arriving in the 11th century, adding yet another distinct wave on top of everything that came before. Each of these waves left a measurable genetic signature layered into the existing population, a level of sustained Mediterranean and Near Eastern contact that northern Italy, further from these particular trade and conquest routes, experienced far less directly. Northern Italy's genetic history followed a noticeably different set of population movements. Pre-Roman northern Italy was home to Celtic-speaking Gaulish tribes, whose territory Roman writers referred to as Cisalpine Gaul, meaning Gaul on this side of the Alps, genetically connecting the region to populations further north and west across the mountains rather than across the Mediterranean. After the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, Germanic groups including the Ostrogoths and later the Lombards moved into northern Italy and established lasting political control over the region for centuries, the Lombards giving their name to the modern region of Lombardy and leaving behind Germanic legal traditions, place names, and genetic ancestry that persisted long after their kingdom itself was eventually absorbed by the Franks. These are fundamentally different historical population movements than the Greek, Arab, and Norman waves that shaped the South, and the genetic record preserves that difference clearly enough for modern sequencing technology to detect it with precision, even after more than 1,000 years of a shared peninsula and, eventually, a shared nation. Picture the Italian peninsula roughly 2,500 years ago, not as one unified place, but as two ends of a very long, narrow landmass caught between two entirely different spheres of influence. In the south, Greek ships are landing on Sicilian shores, founding cities, establishing trade networks stretching back across the Mediterranean toward Greece, Anatolia, and the Levant. In the north, Celtic tribes hold territory that connects far more naturally to Gaul and Central Europe than to anything happening on Sicily's coastline. Rome, when it finally rises and unifies the entire peninsula under one political system centuries later, inherits two ends of Italy that had already been shaped by two almost entirely separate genetic and cultural histories, stitched together administratively long before they were ever stitched together biologically. Here's the twist that adds one more unexpected layer to the story. The same 2019 study found that this same regional patchwork of ancestry sources also shaped how much Neanderthal DNA different Italian populations carry today. Because different ancestral source populations across Eurasia carried slightly different amounts of Neanderthal ancestry to begin with, the specific mix of ancient populations that came together to form modern southern versus northern Italians left behind measurably different levels of Neanderthal genetic material, a detail invisible to any historical record, readable only in the genome itself, tens of thousands of years after the actual interbreeding between modern humans and Neanderthals took place. There's one more piece of this puzzle worth adding for anyone with roots specifically in Sardinia. The same research confirms something earlier studies had already suggested. Sardinia stands apart genetically from both northern and southern mainland Italy, more distinct from either than they are from each other. Protected by its island geography, Sardinia absorbed far less of the later Bronze Age steppe migration that reshaped most of the rest of Europe, leaving modern Sardinians with a genetic profile that sits unusually close to Europe's early Neolithic farmers, a population whose genetic signature has been diluted almost everywhere else on the continent by thousands of years of subsequent migration. So if your family traces back to northern Italy, and someone else's traces back to Sicily or Calabria, the genetics agree with what the history books already documented in detail, even if popular imagination outside Italy never quite caught up. These aren't two branches of one uniform ancestry gently varying by region. They're two populations shaped by genuinely different historical forces: Greek, Phoenician, Byzantine, Arab, and Norman contact in the south, Celtic and Germanic contact in the north, fused together into a single nation only in the last century and a half, while the DNA underneath quietly kept the far older, far more complicated record intact. It's worth being clear about what this genetic difference actually means, and just as importantly, what it doesn't. It isn't a story about which region has a better claim to being truly Italian, or evidence for any of the crude regional hierarchies that have occasionally been dragged out of this kind of research for political purposes over the years. It's a story about just how much layered human history one relatively small peninsula managed to hold on to, written into its people long before anyone thought to draw one national border around all of it. Northern and southern Italians share the overwhelming majority of their DNA, as any two European populations do. What the 2019 study actually mapped wasn't a division. It was a record, a genuinely rare, unusually detailed genetic archive of exactly which ships landed on which shores, and exactly which armies crossed which mountains, over roughly 3,000 years of Mediterranean history.